For a number of weeks now, the Night Watch at the International House of Prayer in Kansas City has been going through the Gospels together, reading it a chapter a day, paying attention to the commands of Jesus. And as I've been going through the Gospels, something has been really sticking out at me and convicting me in a way I didn't expect. Obviously, there are a lot of profound and wonderful things in the gospel. We get insights into Jesus' personality, into his power, into the way he's so kind and gentle with the people he's around. But on this read-through, I've been particularly struck with a certain group of people he's interacting with. The Pharisees. Now, I grew up in church, and I'm really used to the term Pharisee. Everyone knows about the Pharisees. Everyone knows that they aren't good dudes. Generally, it's been taught through a lens that the Pharisees are just so uptight. They're all about the rules, and Jesus was more relaxed, and that's why the Pharisees didn't like Jesus. But is that actually the full picture of what's going on? Or perhaps another way to ask the question, are rules in and of themselves the issue? Because as much as Jesus forgives and loves and he came to save sinners, he also doesn't make any bones about the fact that sin is real and it's bad and we should not do it. After all, he's the guy who said that if you love me, you will keep my commandments. He's the one who gave us the Sermon on the Mount, which is 3 solid chapters of, to put it crudely, rules. How we're supposed to live, how we're supposed to carry our hearts, how we're supposed to treat each other. So there's something more going on than law and not law, or rules and relaxed. So who were the Pharisees, really? And what can we learn from them? Or, to be perfectly honest, the question that I've been asking myself lately, am I one? To understand the Pharisees, you first have to kind of understand what condition Israel was in Jesus' day. The Jews were living in the land, or at least some of them were, but the Roman Empire ruled the land. And this provided a religious conundrum for the Jews in Jerusalem. God has promised us this land. We're living in it. He hasn't driven us out to the nations. But we're being ruled and oppressed by a foreign government. How does that fit in the plan? What do we do with this? How are we to live as the people of God? And what do we do to get our kingdom back? Now, to answer this question, 4 main sects of Judaism arose. Not all of the Jews belonged to one of these sects, because most people were just kind of busy getting on with life and didn't really have the time and energy to invest into hashing this stuff out. But among those who were active in the political and religious realms, there were 4 main camps of what to do with this. You had the Essenes, the Zealots, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. I'm going to give a vastly oversimplified explanation of these groups. If you're interested in looking at this more, I'll give a couple of links in the description to some books that I've found helpful. So let's look first at the Essenes. They're in the land, Rome is oppressing the land. What do? Well, they just kind of wrote off the city of Jerusalem as it stood. They saw corruption in the government, corruption in the priesthood. It's all too bad to save, so they sequestered off in kind of monastic communities to just bunker down, live ascetic, holy lifestyles, and kind of wait for the apocalypse. Now, they don't get a mention in the New Testament, but we know that they were around historically. So if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, those were found at Qumran, which was an Essene community. Secondly, let's take a look at the Zealots. The Zealots decided that their solution to this quandary was to just take up arms and go to war with Rome. Sometimes this resulted in a highly organized rebellion, and sometimes it was more of just like roving gangs of disconnected young men who kind of vaguely wanted to stick it to the man. In fact, Barabbas, who was released at Jesus' trial, was probably a zealot. Then you had the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were mostly comprised of the priests in the temple. The Sadducees were basically the Jerusalem elite. They had the power, they had the money. Their solution was just to really make the best of the circumstance. They had sort of a you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours arrangement with Rome. They kind of didn't care that Rome was in charge as long as Rome was sure to keep the political power and money flowing to them and through them. When Jesus overturned the money tables in the temple, very, very likely that was a Sadducee operation. And because the Sadducees had such a high priority on making nice with Rome, they had all kinds of religious compromise, all kinds of political compromise. They were willing to bend the rules a lot to make sure that they kept the peace and stayed on Rome's good side. And then that leaves us with our guys, the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were looking at this issue. We're in the land, but we don't own the land. This is not what God has promised to us. But they were devout scholars of the law. Most of them weren't priests, but they were teachers. They were rabbis in the synagogues. And they studied the scriptures, and they saw passages like at the end of Deuteronomy, where God gives these chapters of promises. If you keep my commands, you will dwell in the land, you will prosper. If you forsake my commands, if you break my covenant, I will drive you into exile. I will send drought and pestilence and all these lists of the way Israel would suffer if they broke their covenant with Yahweh. The Pharisees go, we've seen this. This is what happened with the exile to Babylon. The people forsook God, worshipped other gods, and he drove them from the land. We can't do that again. We want to dwell in the land. We want to inhabit it. We want it to be ours. So we need to keep God's covenant. So the Pharisees were all about holiness. If we're righteous, if we're walking as the people of God should walk, then we receive the promises. We enter into the fullness. He can't bless us unless we're righteous, so we are going to be righteous. And here's where the problem starts coming in. Because the Pharisees were so determined to be righteous, and they were so determined to teach people righteousness that they started doing it in their own strength and coming up with their own ingenious ways to help people keep the law. One of the open goals of what the Pharisees were doing was to build a hedge or a fence around the law. So for instance, if we assume this microphone, if you transgress the boundaries of the law, God is going to punish us. So we don't want people to break the law. So we're going to set a boundary around the law. And if someone hits our boundary, we can swoop in and correct them there, and they haven't actually pushed through to violate what God has commanded us. Makes sense, right? Well, this is how you end up with what Jesus starts talking about in the Gospels as the traditions of the elders. Traditions about washing your hands, traditions about keeping the Sabbath, where even though keeping the Sabbath is a law that you shouldn't transgress, they had these super specific rules around the Sabbath as far as you can't carry this much weight for this much distance. Or when you get things like the ruler of the synagogue chewing Jesus out for healing somebody on the Sabbath because that's work. That's because the Pharisees had built this big system around the law to try and keep the law safe and to try and keep the people safe. But God never commanded the fence. This is the kind of stuff Jesus is talking about when he rebukes them for binding heavy burdens on men's backs that are hard to bear. This is what he's talking about when he talks about keeping people from entering the kingdom, because they're so obsessed with all these rules and parameters, not just because they're rules and parameters, but because these are human efforts, human wisdom, human regulation that wasn't given from God, but that they're treating as if it were the commands of God. So not only did this end up creating barriers and hindrance to people actually obeying what God actually said, it produced this kind of self-righteousness that goes beyond the understanding that I have kept God's law and therefore this is pleasing to him because I know what he wants. We all can do that, and that's within the bounds of godliness. But there was this mindset that if I just perform hard enough and I maintain this fence well enough, then that's what I need to do. If I am keeping the law down to the tiniest letter of the tiniest, most obscure tradition that the elders and the fathers have passed down, then I'm golden. I practically have the golden ticket to the kingdom of God, because I know that I have worked hard enough, I know that I am good enough, and I know that I can make it. And this is where they really start colliding with Jesus. Because what is it to a Pharisee if this man says nobody comes to the Father but through me? Like, excuse you, I keep the Sabbath. I wash my hands every time I enter a building, all the time before I eat. I've never lifted a finger on the Sabbath. How dare you say that I have to go through you because I've got this on lockdown? So you have these two factors weighing in that is blinding the Pharisees to the fact that the God who wrote the law is standing before them in the flesh. The God who they're trying to appease through all of these traditions and going above and beyond the call of duty. And surely the Lord will be pleased with me because I have performed well enough for him. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Or in other words, those who know that they desperately need God. This is the Jesus who said to his disciples, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." And the Pharisees were all about trying to do it all apart from God, without his help, without his Spirit, without his Christ. In their own strength, they are going to muscle up the goodness that they need to enter the kingdom. So firstly, you can't do that. You don't have the capability to. And secondly, that's not the point in the first place. Jesus commands us to keep his commandments, to walk in righteousness, to walk according to the Spirit. He gave us the Sermon on the Mount. Like, there are standards he has for us that he wants us to, by our choice, step in obedience and say, yes, I will do this. But it's not just about, like, he needs everything just so for him to be happy. It's because he wants relationship with his people. And he rebukes the Pharisees as the people who honor the Lord with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. It's because the point isn't, I want you to be righteous performers. The point is, I want to be in relationship with you. And that's only possible if we're walking in the Lord's righteousness. Keeping the law, doing the works, is not in and of itself enough. So as I've been looking at the Pharisees and looking at these men who studied the Word of God deeply and intensely, who orchestrated their whole lives around keeping the law, around teaching others to keep the law, and they look the Son of God in the face and then go back and consult with each other of how they might kill him. That's alarming to me. For my own frame, my own personality, I am so aware of how easy it is to fall back on, just tell me what to do. Give me some expectations, give me some goals, and I will focus in and work really, really hard to try and meet that standard. So it is so easy for me to slip into that idea of, I am determined to be righteous, and so I'm going to run off in my own strength, with my own energy, with my own ideas of what this looks like and what it's going to require of me, and I'm going to be righteous. And the Lord's like, hey, you going to include me in this or what? So when I look at not being a Pharisee, I'm trying to get my brain out of the mindset that, oh, this is the stodgy religious people who don't like Jesus. But going, this is what happens when you hit cruise control on your relationship with the Lord. How easy it is to get checked out, to get self-assured that I am performing my religious duty, and that's pretty much what there is to do, right? So as we're going through the Gospels, I'm not looking at the Pharisees as those doofuses back then who missed the Messiah. I'm looking at these guys who really were convinced they were doing the right thing because they let their pride into it, because they let their performance mentality take the reins, because they stopped actually talking to the one who made the law in a relational way. They started to treat him as like this OCD taskmaster who just wanted them to perform well, and if they could perform well, they were golden. And I see my own tendencies in that. I go, Lord, help me to stay connected to who this is really about. Help me to keep a teachable, tender, open heart to your word. Help me in my pursuit of holiness, in my studying the scriptures, not to lose sight of the fact that these are the things that testify of you. It's not about me being spiritual and awesome. I am poor and weak and blind and so in need of the Spirit of God. And help me to stay connected to that so I don't start resenting you for the claims you make, so I don't start arguing with you like I know the law better than you do. So I'd encourage you as you read the Gospels, don't be too quick to skip past Jesus talking to the Pharisees as if that's just about them and not about us. Because I think especially for those of us who might have grown up in the church, this is something that we could really stand to take a lesson or two from. Not as a scary panic pressure thing, but as a keeping connected with the relationship, keeping connected with Jesus, and letting our righteousness, letting our reading of the word not just be a religious duty, but be an avenue for real fellowship with the Lord and real openness to what it is He's saying to us through those scriptures. If you have any thoughts about this, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment on the Facebook page or on the YouTube channel. I'm Amanda Beatty. This has been the Interwebercessor channel, and I will see you next week. Bye!